Welcome to Military Analytics. May was completely marked by the HIMARS raids and inflicted hell on the Russian army on the Ukrainian Eastern Front. HIMARS and Storm Shadow raids caught the Russian forces completely off guard as the Russians prepared for a breakthrough in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian war has long been heavily centered on the eastern axis. The transformation of the war into a struggle of attrition at the operational and strategic levels gave Russia the opportunity to turn its numerical superiority into an advantage in the field of terms of artillery. However, Russia quickly lost this advantage as well. Ukrainian artillery was reinforced with modern Western systems. New weapons included the French Caesar, the German CZ-2000, the Polish Krab, and most importantly, the American HIMARS M777 and M109 Paladin artillery systems. Especially Caesar and HIMARS are very difficult artillery systems to detect as they can change positions very quickly. With these systems, which gave the Ukrainian artillery range accuracy and agility, the needle started to turn in favor of Ukraine during the artillery duel phase of the war. Thanks to the new weapons, places such as Snake Island in the Black Sea came within range of the Ukrainian artillery. HIMARS were also found to be very useful in destroying ammunition depots behind the front lines. The iconic weapon system of this universe was HIMARS. This week, especially HIMARS raids marked the clashes on the front. Ukrainian forces wiped out 170 artillery systems and thousands of soldiers of the Russian army on both the southern and eastern fronts. American HIMARS were mainly used in the Ukrainian attacks. Moscow troops suffered serious casualties as Ukraine began to make a breakthrough on the front lines. The Ukrainian Army Chief of Staff said in a statement yesterday morning that Russian forces lost 40 artillery systems in the last 24 hours. This is a serious record among the daily losses of the Russian army so far. According to a current count published by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine since May 17, Moscow has lost about 210 artillery systems during this period. The Russian army also lost more than 100 tanks and hundreds of armored vehicles. In addition, the Russian army lost 31 unmanned aerial vehicles in one day. The Russian army carried out 15 heavy missile and drone attacks on Kiev in May. Ukrainian Air Defense Forces achieved more than 90% success against Russian missile attacks. They launched hundreds of missiles and drones into major airstrikes on Kiev this week. However, the Kiev defense managed to intercept 93% of Russian missiles and 96% of UAVs. The number of drones lost since the beginning of the war has increased to 3,000. Besides the losses of unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery, other equipment losses mentioned in the report of the Ukrainian army were also significant. With all these losses, the artillery losses of the Russian army increased to 3,450 and the tank losses to 3,800. While the losses of Russian soldiers reached 210,000. May turned into a nightmare for the Russians, and it was the month of record losses. At the same time, the fate of the war changed completely when the British Storm Shadow missiles were delivered to the Ukrainian army on May 11. Thanks to Storm Shadow, Ukraine was able to target Russian positions, headquarters, and arsenals up to 300 kilometers away. Storm Shadow's power was felt, especially in Mariupol, Melitopol, Zaporizhia, and Berdyansk regions. Another reason for the significant increase in Russian casualties was certainly the British Storm Shadow missiles. On the other hand, it's not difficult to predict that the war in Ukraine will not end anytime soon. Yet, despite incredible odds, Kiev will face Putin's military machine. At the moment, it's not possible for Ukraine to accept any Russian annexation and loss of territory. Ukrainians will not accept Russia's morbid peace terms to liberate all their legal lands, including Crimea. For this, Ukraine needs more powerful Western technology and modern weapons. Despite the huge losses of the Russian army, Vladimir Putin has not yet put his most powerful troops, war machines, and warplanes on the front. However, the fact that the Russian army still has very powerful war machines does not mean that it can win the war, because wars are won with brave soldiers. And this is not the case in Russia. For this to happen, Vladimir Putin would probably have to declare general mobilization. However, this situation will push the Russian Federation into a great stalemate, mass immigration waves, and ignite a great rebellion. On the other hand, Its artillery and supplies have played a crucial role in the war effort conducted by Moscow and Kiev since the outbreak of conflict in February 2022. The U.S. Center for Strategic and International Studies said in January this year that the war in Ukraine has turned into an artillery war. Ukraine has often requested artillery supplies from its Western supporters. The United States has prioritized the supply of artillery in its military aid tranches, including the latest package announced by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin the other day. The Department of Defense stated in a press release that the U.S. will provide 155 mm² and 105 mm² artillery shells, as well as additional ammunition for the HIMARS sent to Ukraine. The U.S. Department of Defense stated that as of May 21st, the U.S. has provided more than 161 155 mm² howitzers, 72 105 mm² howitzers, and 38 HIMARS. In addition to hundreds of modern systems, last month, a U.S. think tank, the Institute for War Studies, announced that Russian forces are using artillery to offset their degraded offensive capabilities, especially Russian forces focused on artillery fire in Bakhmut, the eastern stronghold. Russian artillery fire turned the city into ruins. However, the Ukrainian armed forces shouted to the Russian soldiers and artillery to stop. In early May, the Kiev troops concentrated on counter-offensive operations in Bakhmut. Thus, the advance of the Kiev troops in the city gained momentum. Russian soldiers left their positions and left their flanks open. The Ukrainian army glided through these flanks into the depths of the city with a determined progress of the Ukrainian armed forces. Part of the city was liberated. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian armed forces said in a statement that the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut repelled Russian forces and recaptured a number of buildings. Kiev troops are holding fortifications and numerous buildings in the southwestern part of the city, according to Serhiy Sharavathy, spokesman for the Ukrainian Eastern Forces Group. Also, Ukrainian officials said that the positions around the eastern city of Bakhmut had changed little. Officials noted that the intensity of Moscow's offensive has decreased as Russian regular troops continue to replace Wagner fighters. In another development, Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin appears to have indirectly undermined the authority and regime of Russian President Vladimir Putin once again. Yevgeny Prigozhin answered a journalist's question about the Russian state media banning any discussion about the Wagner forces. Prigozhin noted that unnamed Russian bureaucrats would be the only ones to benefit from such censorship. In the 1 to 3 months before, the Russian people backed down and started hating the bureaucrats. The Wagner leader noted that if Russia had not started the war in Ukraine, the Russian authorities would have enjoyed their historic ability to censor Russian society. He implied that achieving real successes would allow the officials to avoid lying about the construction of new buildings, subway stations, and bridges in an effort to look good. He shifted the discussion from mentioning anonymous Russian officials to addressing a single man directly. Prigozhin's comments most likely target Putin, whom Russian state media routinely portrays as a leader closely involved with small infrastructure projects and the lives of ordinary Russian people. It seems that the failures on the front lines are straining the relations between Russian authorities. Tensions between Wagner and the official Russian authorities are not easing. Russian forces were left completely defenseless on the front lines, and the Russian soldiers were disarmed, forced to retreat with impressive success. Ukrainian forces captured a convoy of ammunition for 10,000 Russian soldiers. These captured weapons and ammunition are now being used against Russian soldiers. These weapons, part of Putin's massive investment in the military industry, have joined the Ukrainian army's inventory and increased their superiority. Although Putin ordered his disarmed troops not to withdraw from the area, the Kremlin refused to allow it and further complicated the situation. As a result of the strong Ukrainian offensive, many of the Russian occupiers' headquarters had to be completely evacuated. This operation in Bakhmut has received a lot of attention from the international media. The operation raised the issues of the great difficulties faced by the Russian forces in the war and the growing strength of Ukraine. The war between Russia and Ukraine has now been going on for over a year. At the beginning of the war, Russian forces quickly advanced into Ukrainian territory and took control of it. Today, however, in the face of the strength of Ukrainian forces, the Russian army has begun to withdraw from many areas and is experiencing difficulties. This has led to major changes in Russia's war strategy and has shown that Ukraine's resistance is getting stronger. As part of Putin's plan to completely occupy Bakhmut, the decision to deploy 10,000 troops to the region was put into practice. The aim was to successfully carry out a major operation and give Russian forces full control of the region. With Putin's decision, the troops quickly set official. However, it turned out that Putin made an important mistake during this deployment process, as seen in previous operations. Putin, who suffered great losses due to his incompetent strategies, suffered setbacks in the planning phase this time. The preparations for the weapons and equipment required for the arrival of the troops were made quite late. At a time when the Ukrainian army's attacks were intensifying, this delay was considered an unforgivable mistake. As the troops began to advance towards the Bakhmut front, Putin ordered the weapons and ammunition to be loaded onto trucks and shipped. These delays and mistakes once again exposed Putin's weaknesses in military planning. Ukrainian forces seized the opportunity and put up a determined resistance against Russian forces in the battle on the Bakhmut front. The Ukrainian army began to gain a strategic advantage by maximizing its resources. The fact that Putin's troops were fighting unarmed and ill-equipped further undermined the morale of the Russian forces, leading to questions about Putin's leadership and military capabilities. While Putin's mistakes and failures were being debated both within Russia and in the international community, Ukrainian forces put up a strong resistance in the war and gained international support and prestige. These developments on the Bakhmut front were considered a major turning point in the course of the war and signaled a further strengthening of the resistance against the Russian occupation. In particular, the intelligence support provided by Turkey and Israel enabled Ukraine to advance decisively in the war. This operation on the Bakhmut front began to change the balance between the parties to the war. Since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has failed to protect its territory by resisting the Russian occupation. Russia, on the other hand, faced more resistance than expected, revealing the shortcomings in Putin's strategic planning and military weaknesses. These developments were of great importance for the future of the war and the stability of the region. Monitoring the course and outcome of the fighting on the Bakhmut front has become one of the top priorities of the international community and the countries of the region. With the arrival of the Russian army on the Bakhmut front, it would have been difficult to predict an unexpected surprise. The Russian troops had a relaxed attitude in the region, thinking that the operation would be easy and quick. But they forgot one major factor. Ukrainian forces have been patrolling the Bakhmut region intensively for a long time, constantly using Bayraktar drones. During the last patrol, the Barracudas relayed surprising information about the incredible concentration of troops in the Russian headquarters. This information, which indicated that there were soldiers at every headquarters point, indicated that the Russian invaders would attempt a new invasion. Bayraktars emphasized that this invasion would be much bigger and tougher than the previous ones and suggested that the headquarters should start preparations immediately. This intelligence information gave the Ukrainian army a great advantage. Once the intentions of the Russian invaders were determined, defensive preparations were quickly launched on the Bakhmut front. The headquarters took measures to ensure a strong resistance to the attack. Arrangement of weapons and equipment, strengthening of defense lines, and positioning of military units were carried out quickly. Thanks to this important intelligence provided by Bayraktar drones, the Ukrainian army was able to meet the Russian invaders with an unexpected counterattack and prevent them from completely occupying Bakhmut. This turned the Russian army's plans upside down and marked an important turning point in the course of the war. Developments on the Bakhmut front attracted the attention of the international community, which continued to support Ukraine's resistance. The Ukrainian forces mobilized based on intelligence knew that they would face serious difficulties in obtaining weapons and ammunition. Therefore, they prepared a grand plan and deployed Bayraktar unmanned aerial vehicles to determine the departure point of the arms and ammunition convoy to be sent to 10,000 soldiers flying at high altitudes. The Bayraktars detected intense activity at headquarters in the Luhansk region and trucks full of weapons and military equipment. Ukrainian forces took immediate action as soon as they received this intelligence information. Troops were deployed to determine the route of the shipment from Luhansk. Having determined that the route, which was on a narrow road surrounded by mountains on both sides, was ideal for the operation, Ukrainian troops took action to find the most suitable point and completed the necessary preparations. Ukrainian forces placed traps at strategic points on both sides of the road using explosives and blocking traps. The blocking traps were carefully positioned to ensure that Russian delivery trucks could not move. Ukrainian soldiers and camouflage hid on both sides of the road and waited patiently for the operation to begin. Smoke bombs were used to limit the visibility of Russian forces, and Ukrainian soldiers quickly attacked the trucks and neutralized the Russian soldiers. As a result of the operation, which was carried out with the help of explosives, the armored vehicles with Russian soldiers were completely destroyed, and the delivery trucks were rendered unusable. Ukrainian forces took advantage of the confusion among Russian soldiers and moved quickly with the advantage of smoke bombs. Ukrainian soldiers emerged from the trucks and launched an effective attack against the Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers were captured, many of whom were caught while trying to escape. Ukrainian forces realized that there was an unexpected military force inside the trucks. The weapons and ammunition loaded into the trucks were ready to be sent to the Ukrainian forces' headquarters. This successful operation was greeted with great joy by the Ukrainian army, while the Russian soldiers stationed on the Bakhmut front were unaware of anything. Ukrainian forces mobilized to deal a bigger blow to the Russian forces armed with the weapons they captured from the Russian occupiers. Ukrainian forces advanced towards the headquarters of unarmed Russian soldiers in simultaneous operations against Russian headquarters on the Bakhmut front. Russian forces were driven out of the area. When Putin received the news, he flew into a rage and ordered the troops to stay and fight. However, the Kremlin did not follow this order, and Russian troops began to leave the area and retreat back to Russian territory. Putin's anger escalated, and many Russian soldiers who began to evacuate their headquarters were captured and taken prisoner by Ukrainian forces. The operation was hailed as a great success by the Ukrainian military and was widely reported around the world. Ukrainian forces showed their determination to continue their operations by further increasing their forces. The Russian army faced a very big problem thanks to this operation in this cross-border operation organized by Ukraine against Russia. Things got very complicated for Putin. The place where the ammunition for the Russian army was stored blew up so much that the whole of Russia groaned. What was discussed in Russian media after this latest operation stunned the whole world. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army took a very different step. The Russian army, successive security breaches in many strategic areas paved the way for the Ukrainian army to take a step. The Ukrainian army was aware of the difficulties experienced against the Russians in hot conflicts and the need to use the support received from foreign policy. Therefore, as a result of the intelligence received from Ukrainian agents in the Russian army, it decided to organize a very large operation. And this operation dealt the Russians the strongest blow so far. The Ukrainian army has recently started to make great strides against the Russians. One of the main ones was targeting the strategic ammunition headquarters of the Russian army. Although many ammunition and weapons convoys were going to Bakhmut and Solder from the Russian land borders, the Ukrainian army was aware that there was a center for them, and it decided to send its drones towards the Russian land borders to detect this point, taking a huge risk. These latest developments were actually going to reveal Putin's whole disgrace. When the route of the convoy sent to the Russian army was traced backward, the Ukrainian army noticed something strange, even though it was not on their route. Then it was determined that it passed through Belgorod. The Ukrainian army immediately started preparations for the Russian army. This major security breach would lay the foundation for a very big problem with this step. The move that would change the course of the war for the Ukrainian army was revealed. But at this point, the Ukrainian army faced a huge problem. Although it was important for them to have the range to launch missiles directly at the main ammunition depot in Belgorod, the Ukrainian army was in a dilemma about organizing the operation because the Russian army had deployed the main ammunition depot in a forested area. But it was precisely at this point that Ukrainian agents inside the Russian army shared a huge piece of information. The Russian army had inadvertently directed the air defense systems in the area to protect its troops in Bakhmut. Following these latest developments, the Ukrainian army has once again revealed the most important tool it has been using since the beginning of the war and begun preparations to strike the Russian army right in the heart. The Ukrainian army mobilized drones to use against the Russians. The Ukrainian army, aware of the Russian army's troops stationed in this region, and especially of the equipment and the headquarters, has decided to mobilize a group of special forces personnel for this war in order to turn the tide in its favor. Although the Ukrainian army did not consider this decision to be a decisive point, this team made the most important move. The special forces personnel and unmanned aerial vehicles to be involved in the operation mobilized after completing their preparations and moved to deal the biggest blow to the Russian army. Ukrainian drones started to move towards the region. The drones, which flew at high altitude and did not get caught by the Russian observation troops, received a huge shock when they arrived in the region. The warehouse where the ammunition was kept was very big, and at this point, the explosives in the hands of the Ukrainian army would not be enough to blow it up. Nevertheless, Ukrainian drones started to bombard the warehouse one after the other. The Russian soldiers were at a loss and tried to fight back, but to no avail. Thinking that this area was protected by air defense systems, the Russian military was both surprised and shocked. However, the Ukrainian bombardment did not hit the right spots and did not go beyond evacuating the Russian army. The Ukrainian special forces then mobilized, and they looked at the compartmentalized ammunition inside the headquarters evacuated by the Russian army. The Russian army had put all the explosives together. Realizing this, the Ukrainian army started to place all the remote-controlled C4s they had at the point where the explosives were located before the Russians came back. In addition, the Ukrainian army, which did not hesitate to use the explosives in the Russian inventory, had reached a point where it would create a very big explosion. It immediately retreated from the area and started to ambush nearby. When it was realized that the Russian army was slowly returning to the area, the headquarters was shaken by a huge explosion, and the operation of the Ukrainian army by the Ukrainian special forces was a success. This last step was a great opportunity to turn everything in favor of Ukraine. Russians heard the explosions nearby and immediately informed Russian media outlets, but Putin knew about it first, and things changed completely when he imposed a broadcast ban on the news immediately after this move. When the reason for this broadcast ban was learned, the whole world was shocked. Russian President Vladimir Putin has taken very different steps in recent days. At the beginning of the war, Putin, who instantly shared all kinds of cross-border operations carried out by Ukraine with the whole world, gave up this situation because he realized how helpless Russia has looked in recent days after these recent developments. Putin's public stance started to change. While the Ukrainian army is the main source of information for the whole world, only the Russian people get news from Putin. Of course, when this created a huge confusion, things became even more complicated. While it was clear that the Ukrainian army was a clear victory, it was recorded as a very big screen that the Russian army used to hide such operations. And this has revealed that many figures in the Russian media are using it to cast a shadow over Ukraine's success. These latest developments have been recorded as the biggest indicator of the situation. The steps taken by the Ukrainian army for some time and the success of the policy as it has been following have been persistently concealed by Putin. Following these developments, the Ukrainian army is expected to make many moves that will change the course of the war in a short time. But Putin has started to fear this situation in recent days, realizing that many steps to be taken against the Russian army will put Russia in a more and more troublesome situation. Putin has passed a very big censorship policy through the parliament. On the basis of this, the fact that the war which he claimed that he would end in 2 weeks lasted for nearly 1.5 years caused the Russian people to be very angry. After that, the constant losses against Ukraine have also become disturbing. But the real problem is that Russia now needs to experience political changes in many areas. Realizing that these political changes could create very serious problems, the Russian military is expected to accept defeat against Ukraine in a short time. But Putin's real concern about these issues is different. He is now realizing that he has become a very bad leader in the eyes of the people. Add to this a heavy defeat in all four. They entered out of necessity, and things could get much more complicated for Putin. At this point, Putin is using both the censorship law and the state apparatus to absorb and conceal such operations. In the continuation of this use, it may be possible for the Ukrainian army to make a gain in a short time. As a result of recent developments, it has been revealed that Putin has been concealing all cross-border operations organized by Ukraine through certain institutions and organizations. Putin has mobilized to once again conceal Ukraine's operations. Thanks to these new developments, the Ukrainian army will be more confident and mobilized to launch a massive operation against the Russians. This will soon form the basis for Putin's resignation.